So the human brain has been termed the most complex 3 pounds in the universe. And it's not hard to see why when we consider the fact that we're born with 100 billion neurons or brain cells, and we develop between 250,000 and 500,000 new brain cells every minute in the first few months of life. But it turns out that it's not just the number of brain cells, but the connections between brain cells that's truly extraordinary. So we're actually born with most of our neurons in place, and it's really the connections between cells that constitutes most of early brain growth. And these brain connections become increasingly complex from birth through the first 3 or 4 years of life. So here you see the connections between brain cells at birth, at 3 months, and at 2 years. And in fact, by age 3, we have 1,000 trillion connections between our brain cells. Now, importantly, early experience shapes this brain developmental process. So you may have heard of the use it or lose it phenomenon, whereby connections between brain cells that are used frequently strengthen, whereas those that are not are dropped or pruned. And it turns out that the brain is most plastic or able to make these new connections early in childhood in the first 3 or 4 years. Now, of course, children's experience varies dramatically as a function of their family's social and economic circumstances. And so we can use socioeconomic circumstance as a lens through which to study brain development. So a little bit of background. What is poverty? Well, poverty is a number defined by the federal government that varies by family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. Interestingly, though, it doesn't vary geographically. So that means that a family of 4 here in New York City has the same poverty line set for them as a family in, say, South Dakota, even though, of course, the cost of living in those 2 places is very different. Now, does anyone want to throw out a guess of what the current poverty line is for a family with 2 adults and 2 children? Someone has been reading. So right around $24,000. Nice job. So although many of us might struggle to imagine what it would be like to raise a family of 4 here in New York on $24,000, poverty is nonetheless incredibly prevalent, currently affecting more than 16 million children, or over 1 in 5 children here in the US. And of course, as we all know, growing up in poverty puts children at risk for a host of negative physical health, mental health, and achievement outcomes. Now, it's important to realize that socioeconomic status, or SES, as I'll be talking about in today's talk, is more than just poverty. So I just told you that poverty is strictly based on family income, whereas SES is typically thought to comprise income as well as parents' educational attainment, occupational prestige, and subjective social status, or sort of where one sees oneself on the social hierarchy. And we know that childhood SES, when conceptualized in this way, is associated with a number of broad outcome measures that are important for children's cognitive development. Things like school achievement test scores, grade retention, whether a child has moved on to the next grade in school, literacy, IQ, and school graduation rates. And in fact, it turns out that the SES gap in cognitive development and academic achievement tends to emerge pretty early in childhood and really widen throughout the elementary years. So these are data from the British cohort study of 1970, which followed tens of thousands of children in the UK from about age 2 to about age 10. Now, at each age, they administered a battery of neuropsychological tests similar to an IQ test. Of course, when you're administering a set of tests to a 2-year-old, it's going to be a very different set of tests than those you would administer to a 10-year-old. So to account for that, on the y-axis here, we have cognitive performance in percentile, meaning a child's relative performance relative to other children of the same age. So with that in mind, I first want to draw your attention to children who started out performing at the 90th percentile at age 2, so better than 90% of other 2-year-olds in terms of cognitive performance, and who happen to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. So perhaps unsurprisingly, those high SES, high early scoring children tended to perform above average throughout the course of childhood. Okay. Next, I want to draw your attention to children who started out at the 10th percentile, so performing below 90% of other 2-year-olds, who happen to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. Now, unfortunately, though perhaps not surprisingly, those low SES, low early scoring children tended to perform below average throughout the course of childhood. What's a little bit more surprising is what happens when we consider what we might term the crossover groups. So first, I want to draw your attention to children who also started out at the 10th percentile, near the bottom of the distribution, but who happened to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. So those children actually rose in their relative rank over the course of childhood, so that by age 10, they were actually performing at or even a little bit above average. And finally, and most disconcertingly, I want you to consider children who started out at the 90th percentile, at the top of the heap of cognitive performance at age 2, but who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. So those children actually fell in their relative rank over the course of childhood, so that by age 10, a child's family socioeconomic circumstance is actually a much better predictor of cognitive development than his early cognitive skill. So I think this is a particularly stark illustration of the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in cognitive development over the course of early and middle childhood. But it leads to the question, what are the factors that are contributing to this SES gap in cognition and achievement? So to answer that question, you might think of things like differences in exposure to healthy, nutritious foods, differences in prenatal care or perinatal complications, differences in prenatal drug exposure, illicit or otherwise, differences in exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home learning environment or early schooling, and differences in exposure to family stress. And to this laundry list and the many others that you all are likely thinking of now, I would say yes. Really, each of these has been shown to contribute in part to the link between socioeconomic status and children's cognitive skill. So how do we make sense of this? Well, one way is to recognize that quote-unquote cognitive skill is really too broad. By which I mean that traditional achievement measures like IQ are really not specific in terms of brain function. Put another way, there's no one high school graduation part of the brain. So we can really be much more specific in asking which particular cognitive skills and corresponding brain areas seem to be most strongly associated with family socioeconomic background. And so that brings us to a cognitive neuroscience approach. So cognitive neuroscience is a discipline that teaches us that distinct brain structures and circuits support different kinds of cognitive skills. Things like language, memory, executive function, which has to do with the ability to regulate one's thoughts and one's emotions, visual spatial skills, and a host of other more precise cognitive outcomes. And so using the lens of cognitive neuroscience, we can ask, which core cognitive systems seem to be most strongly associated with family socioeconomic background? And so that's exactly the line of questioning that we pursued in a series of studies about 10 years ago now, in which we recruited several samples of socioeconomically diverse families with children ranging in age from kindergarten through adolescence. And in each of these samples, we administered a series of neurocognitive tests designed to tap into particular brain systems. Now, these are data from one of those studies in a sample of 150 New York City first graders, but it turned out that our results across studies were actually remarkably consistent. So in these graphs here, you have SES on the x-axis with higher SES towards the right, so more socioeconomically advantaged on the right, and cognitive performance on the y-axis with higher scores indicating better cognitive performance. So in general, children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tended to outperform their peers from more disadvantaged backgrounds, but this finding was particularly robust in 3 areas, namely in children's language skills, as well as memory and executive function, which again has to do with the ability to regulate one's thoughts and emotions. And so, building on this work, we have several new questions that we're pursuing. So the first is just how early in infancy or early childhood are these SES disparities detectable? The initial work started with kindergarten on up, where we already found remarkable differences by the time children were starting formal schooling. Just how early in their lives can we detect these differences in cognitive performance? Secondly, how do these differences in children's cognitive and behavioral performance relate to differences in the structure of their brains themselves? Third, which particular experiences seem to account for SES differences in children's cognitive and brain development? And finally, and most dear to my heart, how can this work inform interventions? Okay, so starting with the first question, just how early are these effects detectable? So to ask this question, we recently completed a study in which we recruited 179 infants from socioeconomically diverse families who happened to be part of a larger birth cohort. We were fortunate to be able to study these children longitudinally. Half of them we studied from 9 to 15 months and half from 15 to 21 months of age. And we administered some commonly used tests of infant language and memory development. So to orient you, here on the x-axis we have children at 9 months, 15, and 21 months. And on the y-axis, we have performance on a composite of language skills. Now again, the kinds of tests that you're able to administer to a 9-month-old infant are very different from those you could administer to a child who's almost 2. So again, on the y-axis, we have performance relative to other children of the same age. Now here in blue, you have children born to the most highly educated parents. The red line represents children born to middle-educated parents. And the green line represents children born to the least educated parents in the sample. So what I want you to notice is that from 9 to 15 months, the lines are relatively flat, meaning we're not really seeing the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in language development by that point. However, between 15 and 21 months, you see a very different picture. So here you see children of the most highly educated parents rising to the top of the distribution, and children of the least educated parents unfortunately falling to the bottom of the distribution. And it turns out that this difference isn't just what we call statistically significant, but it's clinically significant as well. So the difference between these two lines in statistical terms is about 0.8 standard deviations. To give you a sense of the magnitude, that's equivalent in magnitude to about 12 IQ points. Now again, this wasn't an IQ test we were administering, it was a series of tests of children's language skill, but it nonetheless gives you a sense of just how large the disparities are already before children even turn 2. And the story was very similar for children's memory development. Again, between 15 and 21 months, you see the emergence of these disparities. And again, the magnitude of the difference between the children of the most highly educated parents and the children of the least educated parents was about 0.8 standard deviations. So really quite large. Okay, so moving on to what we can actually say about the brain itself. How do these differences in cognitive development relate to differences in children's brain structure? So I've told you now that children's socioeconomic background tends to be related to children's memory skill that's been shown now in children ranging from infancy through adolescence. And we've known since the 1950s that memory is largely dependent on a structure known as the hippocampus, depicted here in green, located deep within the temporal lobes of the brain. And as early as the 1950s, it was shown that in many cases, individuals with larger hippocampi tend to have better memory skill. So we hypothesized that children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds might have larger hippocampi. And in fact, that's what we found, that higher family income tends to be associated with greater hippocampal volume in the children. And this finding has now been replicated in 4 independent labs across the country, so it does seem to be a pretty robust finding. Now, what can we say about the rest of the brain? So due to some statistical constraints that I won't get into here, most studies of brain structure focus on one or just a few brain structures. You really need a very large sample to be able to look across the entire brain. So I was very fortunate to be able to collaborate with investigators in the Pediatric Imaging, Neurocognition, and Genetics, or PING study last year, which was a very large study in the brain imaging world of over 1,000 children and adolescents ranging in age from 3 to 21. And fortuitously for our questions, it was a very diverse sample. So they were recruited from 10 sites across the US, and the span of parental educational attainment was quite large, with some parents who had less than a high school education, others who had a graduate degree. And the income span was also rather large, with some families living below the poverty line and others living many times above it. So because of the very large sample, we were able to ask the question of how family socioeconomic circumstances relate to brain structure across the entire brain. And importantly, this study controlled for genetically defined race, meaning that any findings linking family socioeconomic background to children's brain structure was independent of genetic race. So again, we found that higher family income was associated with larger brain structure, in this case, larger cortical surface area, or the nooks and crannies on the surface of the brain that are responsible for most of the cognitive heavy lifting that we do. So here, these brain maps show the areas of the brain where that relationship held, where at any one point, higher family income was associated with larger brain size. So you can see that in general, it held true across most of the brain surface. But what I want to point out to you was that there were some areas where this relationship was stronger than others. So the areas in yellow represent areas where this relationship was particularly strong. So here on the side of the brain, you see areas that largely support language development. Here in this picture, you could imagine cutting straight through the middle of the brain. This area in the front of the brain, part of the prefrontal cortex, is very important for supporting executive function, which again has to do with regulating thoughts and emotions and staying on task. Now there's a couple of important points and caveats I want to point out here. The first is that this relationship between family income and cortical surface area in children was strongest among the most disadvantaged families. So that means that dollar for dollar, any differences in income were associated with particularly or proportionally greater differences in cortical surface area among the most disadvantaged families. So put another way, an additional $10,000 goes a long way for a family making $25,000 a year. For a family making $200,000 a year, it doesn't amount to that much. The second point that's really critical here is that there's dramatic variation from person to person. So yes, I can say that across the entire sample of 1,100 children, in general, higher family income is associated with greater cortical surface area. But there were many children from low-income families who had large surface areas, and many children from high-income families who had small surface areas. So in no way could someone tell me a child's family income and I'd be able to predict with any accuracy what that particular child's brain surface area would look like. You know, a similar analogy is with height. So we all know that at a given age, most boys are taller than most girls, but of course we all know that there are many girls who are taller than many boys. Similarly, there are likely multiple mechanisms at play here. So again, going back to height, in addition to gender, there are other things like nutrition and genetics that determine a person's height. Similarly, there are many things outside of family income that are going to determine a child's brain surface area or brain size. Furthermore, we're really interested in trying to unpack just what are the mechanisms behind family income. So what are the differences in experience that are likely causing these differences? Is it differences in nutrition? Is it differences in the number of books and toys in the home? Is it differences in parents' mental health? And likely many other things. And we're currently actively pursuing those questions in my lab. Regardless, we do believe that at least some of the link between family economic circumstance and children's brain development is likely based in differences in experience. And so if we're right about that, if these are in part at least experience-based differences, then one would predict that at birth, we would see very few differences across socioeconomic lines in children's brain function and structure. And so my postdoctoral fellow, Natalie Brito, recently tackled this question by examining a sample of children at birth and looking at their brain function. So I should take a step back and say that the work I just showed you, the neuroimaging work, was conducted using MRI. Now, if any of you have ever had an MRI, you know it involves sitting perfectly still in a dark and noisy tube. It's rather challenging to do with young children. So we have other methodologies that we have at our disposal, including the one I'm showing here, which is electroencephalogram or EEG. So EEG has the nice benefit of being portable. It just involves putting this net on the child's head. The child's able to sit on his or her parent's lap, and in general, they don't mind it too much. So EEG measures electrical activity in the brain, and so we're able to use EEG to assess whether there are any differences in electrical activity in childhood, and in the case of the study I'm about to show you, whether there were any differences at birth. And it turned out there were none. So here on the x-axis we have family income, on the y-axis we have electrical activity, and you can see that regardless of where a family fell on the economic spectrum, there really were no systematic differences in children's brain activity at birth. Okay, so if we believe this story that at least part of the link between family economic circumstances and children's brain development is likely rooted in experience, we can ask what experiences might explain these differences. So I showed you this slide before. My lab is particularly interested in two of these possible mechanisms, namely the home language environment and family stress. And so I'm going to paint you a picture of what I think might be going on here, and then I'm going to give you a flavor of how we're going about testing this theory. So what we think is happening is that we know that there are socioeconomic differences in the quality and quantity of language children hear. And in turn, these differences in the home language environment seem to be important for shaping development of parts of the brain that support the development of language skill. Simultaneously, we know that there are SES differences in exposure to family stress, and it turns out that exposure to stress has important effects on the hippocampus, which I already told you supports memory development, as well as on circuitry that supports the development of regulation of thoughts and emotions. Okay, so turning first to the top part of the model, what can we say about SES differences in the home language environment? So these are data from Hart and Risley, who were pioneering investigators in the mid-90s, who followed a group of children longitudinally from infancy through age 4. And every month, they went into these children's homes and for a few hours tape recorded every word that the children heard and every word that they spoke. And it turned out that at every single age, the children from the higher SES homes heard many more words than the children from the lower SES homes. So that by age 4, if one were to extrapolate out over every waking hour of those children's lives, that amounted to a 30 million word gap. That is, the children from the more advantaged homes, on average, heard 30 million more words over the course of their brief lifetime than the children from the more disadvantaged homes. And it turned out it wasn't just the number of words that varied so dramatically, but also the complexity of the verbal interactions, as well as the responsiveness or the conversational nature of the verbal interactions. And later it was shown that the number of words children heard was directly related to their vocabulary size. So how does this relate to the development of language-supporting brain regions? Well, recent work by Patricia Kuhl at the University of Washington suggests that it may. So she's done a series of very interesting experiments suggesting that one-on-one social interaction is critical for shaping the development of language-supporting brain regions. So in one of these studies, she invited a group of monolingual English-exposed infants, so children who had only ever been exposed to English in their lives, into the lab. Some of these children were assigned to spend several hours a week interacting one-on-one with a Mandarin Chinese speaker. So this individual did all the normal things you would do with a baby, speaking, playing, reading, but did it in Chinese that the babies had never heard before. A second group of these English-speaking infants were sent down the hall and heard the exact same interactions on closed-circuit TV. So heard all of the same Chinese words, Chinese language, Chinese interactions, but didn't have the one-on-one interaction with the individual. And then there was another group who never encountered any Chinese language at all. So what happened at the end of these 8 weeks? Well, it turned out that the children who were exposed a couple times a week to these one-on-one interactions, when the investigators examined their brain function, their brains exhibited patterns suggesting that they were able to discriminate sounds in the Chinese language just as well as native Chinese-speaking infants. Meanwhile, the kids who had been assigned to go down the hall and hear the Chinese language on TV were no better at discriminating the Chinese sounds than were the infants who had never been exposed to Chinese in the first place. So it suggests that there's something about the one-on-one interaction of a language speaker with a language speaker that really helps to shape the development of brain structures that support language development. So we're trying to ask this question a little bit more directly as to whether the home language environment might explain SES differences in brain structure and function. And to do so, we're using something called the LENA, or Language Environment Analysis software tool. It's this small 2.5-ounce device that can be tucked into the pocket of specialized clothing. And it's essentially a digital recorder, so it records every word that the child hears and every word that the child speaks. But unlike Hart and Risley, who had to take their cassette tapes back to the lab and transcribe all of these interactions, we have the pleasure of just being able to insert our LENA into our USB drive, and then it automatically uploads and gives us an output of the number of words that the children heard and when they heard them, as well as a number of other metrics as well. So using this tool, we're hoping to really provide more evidence as to whether differences in the home language environment might help to explain socioeconomic disparities in structure and function of brain regions that support language. Okay, so I hope that gives you a flavor of what we're trying to do. Turning to the other arm of the pathway, what can I tell you about socioeconomic disparities in stress? Well, of course, it's no surprise that lower socioeconomic backgrounds are associated with higher family stress due to differences in things like access to material resources, chaos in the home, exposure to neighborhood violence. And it turns out that when families are exposed to high levels of stress, their family relationships tend to be characterized by conflict or emotional withdrawal rather than with the loving, warm, and nurturing relationships that we know are so important for children's development. And this does take a toll on the developing body and mind. So a number of reports now have suggested that disadvantaged children may have altered levels of stress hormones. And it turns out that there are several regions of the brain that are particularly sensitive to the level of stress hormones. Two that I'm particularly interested in, again, are the hippocampus, which I've told you supports memory, and these areas that support regulation of thoughts and emotions. So to get to this question of whether chronic stress exposure might explain SES differences in brain structure and function, we are collecting stress hormone, or cortisol, non-invasively from the hair of parents and children who come into our lab. So it turns out that stress hormone is secreted continuously into hair. It's a non-invasive way to get at that measure, and we can really ask whether this biological index of stress might be explaining the known socioeconomic differences in brain structure and function. So again, I wanted to give you a flavor of the kinds of questions that we're pursuing in my lab, but I did that fairly quickly because I really wanted to focus on the next part of the talk, which is namely that if we're right that socioeconomic differences lead to differences in experience, which in turn shape brain and behavior, then we can ask the question, if this experience is so important, can our work inform interventions? And furthermore, what's the right level at which to intervene? So one could imagine intervening at what I'm calling the most proximal level, at the level of children's cognition itself, or the level of educational interventions. So without question, this represents the most common form of intervention aimed at addressing socioeconomic disparities in achievement. And while I would be the last person to ever deny the critical importance of quality early childhood education, if we're waiting until children start school formally at age 4 or 5, we are likely waiting too late. I already told you that by age 2, we're already seeing remarkable differences as a function of family socioeconomic background in children's cognitive development. So again, early quality preschool is critical, but it's not enough. So what about acting a bit earlier by changing families' experience through, for example, parenting interventions? So clearly there are a host of parenting interventions, many of which tend to be quite effective. But on the one hand, it's one thing to bring several dozen women into your lab and teach them about the importance of talking frequently and richly to your children or giving them strategies to reduce stress in the home. It's quite another to scale this up to an intervention that's meaningful on a public health level. And so while many of these interventions can be effective, they often are quite difficult to scale up. Now, that's not to say that there aren't many interventions that even on the public health level show moderate effects. Things like nurse-family partnerships represent a very important home visiting program. Nonetheless, those larger interventions tend to often suffer with problems both of uptake and attrition. So I want to challenge you to ask whether it might be possible to intervene at what I'm calling the most distal level by changing SES itself. Now you might say, well, you can't assign people to different socioeconomic circumstances, and on the one hand that's true, but on the other hand, a small amount may go a large way. So correlational work suggests that a $4,000 increase in annual income between the prenatal year and age 2 leads to dramatic differences for those children when they grow up. So they earn more, they work more hours per year, and there's even some evidence that their health is improved in adulthood. So with that in mind, I'm very excited to be part of a group of social scientists and neuroscientists from around the country planning and piloting the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. So we recently completed a pilot study that I'll tell you about, and we're currently raising funds for the larger study And in the larger study, our goal is to recruit 1,000 low-income mothers from sites across the US and randomize them. So half will receive a large monthly income supplement and half will receive a nominal monthly income supplement. Both groups will receive this supplement every month for the first 3 years of their children's lives. So in this way, we'll actually be able to test whether reducing poverty causes important differences in the development of children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development in the first 3 years when we know that the developing brain is most malleable to experience. So the plan is that we'll be handing out debit cards in the hospital at the time that the mothers give birth, and then following these families up annually through the first 3 years, following up on these important measures of children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development, as well as on important measures of family functioning and parenting. Our theory is that we expect that this income will affect families largely through 2 pathways. One is one I'm calling the increased enrichment, or sort of what money can buy pathway. So are parents buying more books and toys? Are they taking more trips to the museum? Can they afford higher quality childcare or better neighborhoods? And the other is what I'm calling the reduced stress pathway. So here the idea is that if parents are less concerned about keeping the lights on, if they're less worried about whether they have to work that 3rd job, are they more able to be present and engage with their children in a warm and nurturing manner? And I should say that the answer is probably different from one family to the other. So we will be characterizing these pathways carefully, but in the end, it's really the final outcome that matters. So as I mentioned, we recently completed a pilot of this work with 30 women here in New York City, and we're pleased to find that it does seem to be a highly feasible approach. So in this pilot study, we had over 90% retention over the course of the year, and really very few problems with debit card implementation. So most moms used the debit card within the first few weeks of receiving it. They used it monthly upon having the funds reload. And interestingly, this was the case even though for over 1/5 of our participants, this was their very first time handling a debit card. And it turns out that even in small amounts, the moms reported that the money tended to make a big difference. So some anecdotal quotes. Believe it or not, even an extra $20 helps. There were times I found myself completely broke. I go and I use it, and that means I can make it for another week. I was able to put at least some of it toward the baby's expenses, which are huge, especially these first few years because there's so many things at once. The money from the card really, really helped me out, especially one month that we didn't have the food stamps, we didn't have anything at all. Now, most moms reported using the card for the baby or for other children in their family, but because it's a debit card, we actually don't have to just take their word for it, we're actually able to track how they're spending the money. And so the point of this slide isn't to have you take a look at all of the different places people spent the money, but what I do like to point out is that out of the 1,112 transactions that took place over the course of the last year, there were exactly 3 that took place at a liquor store. And more importantly than how the parents are spending the money, we're seeing preliminary effects on the children as well. So I should say, please do take these data with a grain of salt. We're talking about a very small pilot group. The predominant point of the pilot study was to test the feasibility of our procedures, not to look for outcome differences. Nonetheless, we were pleased to find trends in the directions that we expected. So in addition to more child-related expenditures, we have reports of more frequent mother-child activities in the intervention group relative to the control group, and importantly, less household chaos and less parenting stress. So I'd like to leave you with this question of whether boosting family income can change children's trajectories for the better. The hope is that this larger study will, in part, answer that question. And if our findings do turn out as we're hypothesizing they will, it should have important implications for policy. So we're hoping that this work will inform debates on the generosity or cuts to both existing social service programs as well as new ones that affect the welfare of families with young children. So it should inform debates about things like SNAP or food stamps, WIC, TANF, housing vouchers, as well as things that have been in the news lately like paid family leave and minimum wage. So I'd like to leave you with this thought that income may not be the only or even the most important factor in children's brain development, but it may be the most manipulable from a policy perspective. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. My thanks to my lab, collaborators, and funders, and I'd welcome your questions.
Kimberly has touched on brain development, economic status, and much, much more. There must be questions. I invite you to interrogate her on what you just heard. Yeah, and I should mention that since we are live casting this somewhere, if you have a question, please go up to the microphone and ask it from there.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for being here and explaining your research to us. I'm wondering whether or not you or other researchers have looked at, children who at age 2 and have high cognitive performance based on the measures that have been taken, those who did not, in fact, follow that natural curve and decline, if there are, what kind of buffering factors can be identified, looking at interventions that might actually explore those factors that can prevent that kind of pattern?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There's a lot of work going on resilience, sort of what are the factors that are protective. I think parents are universally considered to be the most important inoculator, right? So we know that high quality parenting, for lack of a better word, is probably the most important single predictor of children's outcomes. So that, again, would suggest that parenting interventions may be very effective. The question is just whether they're scalable. And so are you intervening at the level of teaching parents how to parent, or are you giving them the resources to make the best decisions for themselves and their families?
How have you ruled out the possibility that income is correlated with a parent's cognitive abilities that are passed on to the children?
It's a great question. So in the correlational work, we haven't. So we're really resting on the shoulders of social scientist colleagues whose work over the years has suggested that at least some of these links are likely based in experience. But you're absolutely right. So the slides that I showed you that showed that there was a correlation between family income and children's brain size, we can't say with any certainty at all what the direction is there. However, with a randomized control trial, we can. So if we're actually experimentally reducing poverty in one group and not another, and then able to follow those children long term to see what effects there might be on children's brain development, then we have a much stronger scientific case.
A second question, how can you rule out sort of the Hawthorne effect, when you're studying families under a microscope, that their performance will improve just because they're being studied?
So they well might. I think it'd be a little challenging to know how that would translate into brain structure, but I suppose it could. But again, if you have a randomized control group or a control trial in which one group is getting a treatment and one group is getting a control, even if both groups exhibited the Hawthorne effect, we would still be able to identify whether there was an interventional effect as well.
In one of the earlier slides that showed the early changes in brain development, the lowest third showed higher performance at the very first age. Is that just a statistical anomaly?
Yeah, great picking up of that. So it's called regression to the mean. It's a pretty common statistical finding, as it were. So one way of thinking about it is that those children who started out at the 90th percentile at age 2, some of them just guessed. Right? So some of them aren't like true 90 percentiles, and same thing at the bottom, right? So some of them aren't true 10th percentiles, they were sick or they, filled in the wrong bubble or whatever. So there's some error there, and so that's captured by regression to the mean over time. So sort of the noise washes out. And then also there's the fact that cognitive tests become more reliable as children get older.
Thanks.
Can I ask you a question, Kimberly? You provided some evidence that this socioeconomic status affects brain surface area. And the assumption was that increases in brain surface area are good things. I can imagine examples where expansion of surface area absent a corresponding increase in neuronal density is not necessarily good. So how do you think about these surface area measurements?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So other work has suggested that increased surface area in childhood at around age 10 is actually correlated with higher intelligence in the children. And then furthermore, in that study, I didn't show you the data, but we replicated past findings that children from higher income families were better performing on a number of cognitive measures, and the increased surface area partially accounted for that.
So there's no danger that the sort of expanded surface area of hippocampus in schizophrenics is, playing into any of the data that you have here?
So I guess I would say on a population level, the relatively small differences in surface area, even at the difference between the highest income and the lowest income children, we're only talking about a 6% difference. So at sort of a population level, no, I don't think those are pathological changes. Could you imagine a pathology that resulted from too much surface area? Probably.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Paul. I'm from Montclair State.
Thanks for your email
University
yesterday.
in New Jersey, yeah. I have a quick question. President Obama, one of his top priority is to have universal pre-kindergarten in the United States for children. My question is, given your research and given the fact that pre-kindergarten, it can be expensive, especially for low-income parents, how necessary is pre-K, especially for low-income students, low-income parents who can't afford to send their children in terms of social development?
So I think it's very important. So I would never argue that we shouldn't be doing pre-K and then just having kids start in kindergarten. I think the situation will be even worse. What I was trying to argue is that pre-K is not enough. So I think really we should be starting earlier. If you look at the rates of eligible children who qualify for Head Start, which as many of you know is federally funded preschool for low-income children, I think there are spots for something around half of children who would qualify. If you look at rates for early Head Start, which is for children 3 and younger, fewer than 10% of kids who would qualify actually have a spot available to them. So we are way underfunded in high-quality early childhood, very early childhood resources.
And my second question is, I'm an aspiring physician. I hope to become a physician one day and work in underserved populations as well. What inspired you, or what experience did you have that allowed you to dwell into this type of research or this topic in terms of socioeconomic disparities?
It's a great question, and I think really speaks to the importance of strong mentorship. So I had spent some time in college working with underprivileged youth, but didn't really expect it to be part of my academic career. At the time, I was starting a graduate program with Martha Farah, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She had spent most of her career becoming quite famous looking at sort of basic aspects of visual cognition, but in her words was plumb sick of it and wanted to turn to real-world examples of cognitive neuroscience. So she asked if I'd be her first graduate student to look at links between poverty and brain development. And she was a tremendous mentor.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.
Thanks so much.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question. Do the groups with the lower socioeconomic status, do they have areas of the brain that are somehow more developed or active than do the groups with higher socioeconomic status? You contrasted the reverse.
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't found that yet. My colleague Nim Tottenham in psychology at Columbia has tantalizing evidence suggesting that children raised in extreme adversity may have earlier development of certain brain systems that might actually be adaptive. So it's an ongoing question that we're interested in pursuing.
I see. Thank you.
The end of your presentation turns to a number of social welfare policies, things that we're hearing from presidential candidates, people who are in Congress, involving minimum wage, involving raising benefits in various social programs. Have any of those recommendations, which we've heard from you, been taken to legislators? Have they been taken to people running for president, so that perhaps they might be included in platforms?
So I don't know about people running for president.
They're wonderful recommendations, but they should become part of the platforms of people running for office.
Well,
Has any of
thank
been
you for
done?
that. I would say that at this point, we strongly hypothesize that our work could be relevant for these policies, but we're really hoping to get the results of the randomized control trial, so we'll be able to have what we call more definitive scientific proof that we'd be able to take to policymakers.
Okay, well, good luck when you take it to that next level.
Thank you.
Because that's where it belongs. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just a second question. Could the results of the Mandarin Chinese study be extrapolated to differences in cognitive development related to, let's say, language on television and language from parents reading to a child?
Absolutely. So it's a study that is often cited as evidence that screen time is not beneficial for teaching children language, whereas one-on-one interaction is.
Thanks.
Thanks again for the presentation. I had a question. You, somewhere in the slides, you mentioned that it'd be $4,000 per family, I guess, throughout the 4 years, or I guess each year would be $4,000?
Yeah, it's each year divided monthly.
Okay. I'm wondering if there's like also some idea of what like the cost-benefit analysis for the other interventions you guys have also identified and how that compares to this possible intervention?
Yeah, I can tell you Head Start costs something around $12,000 a year per child.
Okay.
So I think for the real cost-benefit analysis, we'll have to see what the benefit is at the end of the day. But based on the correlational work, we know that amount is associated with a meaningful difference in cognitive development. So it was sort of chosen as an amount that we thought would produce some bang for our buck, but also as sort of a policy-relevant amount, right? No one's going to give out $1 million a year to every family, so it has to be something that's policy-relevant.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
It occurs to me that the effect of your intervention might be limited, first of all, by other programs that the family is participating in, such as SNAP. If they don't get SNAP and they get your money, they're still not going to do as well as someone who also gets something like SNAP.
So,
And the second question I have is there a limit to the amount of improvement that could be expected? A child must still be limited by his genetic base.
sure. Okay, so to the first question, I guess there's sort of a two-part answer. So whether or not a family gets SNAP should be equally divided across the intervention and control groups if we do randomization correctly. A corollary to that I don't think you were asking, but that's important to note, is that it's very important that the money that we're giving not be counted against families in determination of their benefits. So that's something called clawback. So if we hand them $4,000 and the government takes back $4,000 of benefits, it's not only unethical but scientifically silly to do the study, right? So we are securing clawback waivers in each of these localities to say that for these 125 women in this site for this period of time for this study, this money won't be counted against them for determination of benefits. And part two, of course, people have sort of genetic differences in their ultimate ability to succeed academically. I think the question is just inequality of opportunity.
Thank you again also for the lecture. It was very interesting. I'm curious as to how long you're going to follow the families, just because I would be interested, I think it would be interesting to find out what happens after the age of 2 if this continues. I mean, if the interventions that you've done from now, if they continue to affect them as they grow older.
So it's a 5-year grant proposal that we're currently raising funds for. So and within that 5 years, there's sort of some time to recruit the families at the beginning and time to analyze the data at the end. So it's 3 years of following the families. But absolutely, if our preliminary or 3-year effects are promising, we would love to continue to apply for further funding to follow them on up through adulthood if we can.
So if there are no more questions, I just want to thank Kimberly for a fantastic, captivating lecture. We're in your debt.
Thank you.
Metaphorically, perhaps even financially. I want to say 2 other features of this. One is that Teachers College is obviously a discriminating place to have lured Kimberly from Columbia Medical Center some few months ago to enliven the neuroscience and education program there. The second thing I'd point out is that the quality of questions, I think, has been probing this evening in an impressive way. And so the third thing I want to do, if I can
yes,
just
please.
advance that,
Yeah.
is if you like what you're hearing in these Zuckerman Mind-Brain Institute Stavros Niarchos Foundation lectures, the credit goes to Mort Zuckerman, who is sitting there in the front, and we thank you, Mort, for all you've done. And there are more good things in store. On April the 6th, Daphna Shahami from Psychology, a functional brain imager supreme, is going to give a talk in this lecture series, learning from experience how our brains remember the past and shape our future. That is an unmissable event for all of you, so try and turn up if you possibly can. And it's here in the same place, so this rigmarole of running you around different Columbia ventures to find the place doesn't exist, if you can remember where we are at the moment. And I just want to thank you for all your efforts in getting here tonight, in listening to Kimberly, in probing and interrogating, and we're grateful for your attendance. Thank you very much.